today, and we begin with major breaking news at the courthouse in Maryland, where former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton is expected to face a federal judge next hour. He surrendered to authorities this morning after a felony indictment on charges involving the handling of classified information. Bolton denies any wrongdoing here. The case marks a major escalation in the years-long public feud between Bolton and his former boss, President Trump, and it's the latest in a series of federal indictments against prominent Trump critics. MSNBC's Ken Delanian is outside the courthouse in Maryland, and we're joined now by our legal correspondent, Lisa Rubin, and legal analyst Charles Coleman, and national security and intel analyst Michael Feinberg. Ken, starting with you, bring us up to speed on the latest from the courthouse. What will Bolton and his initial appearance be facing?
Good morning, Ariel. Yeah, that's right. John Bolton walked into this courthouse behind me at around 8:30, and we're expecting him to make an initial appearance at around 11 a.m. That's just a formality. When someone is charged with a federal crime, they make an initial appearance where the charges are read. The magistrate makes sure that they have an attorney. He'll also be booked and processed by the FBI, a mugshot taken, fingerprints taken, that sort of thing. There may be a discussion about terms of his release. But again, just a formality here. There's much more to come in this case, Ariel.
Ken, walk us through the 18 very serious charges that Bolton is now facing.
Yeah, this is a detailed indictment. John Bolton is accused of sending more than 1,000 pages of diary material that investigators say contain highly classified information to his wife and daughter as he was serving as national security advisor, seeing very sensitive information, the most sensitive of the nation's secrets. And he sent it over an unsecure email account and a messaging system. And what this indictment says is that one of his email accounts was hacked by the government of Iran or actors related to Iran. And so some of that classified material got into the hands of adversaries. And he reported the hack to the FBI at the time, according to this indictment, but did not tell them that there was sensitive material at issue, and they only learned that later. And some of these diary entries were discovered in the search of his house in August. He, of course, insists that he did nothing wrong, says he's being targeted by Donald Trump as part of a persecution campaign. His lawyer says that this conduct was gone over by the FBI years ago, and only now is he being charged, and he finds that suspicious, Ariel.
All right. So, Lisa, do these charges, these 18 charges, seem to make sense when you take into account the evidence that so far we're aware of?
The prosecution always gives you the evidence that they believe support those charges. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. I will tell you that based on their recitation of the facts in the indictment, there are other things that they possibly could have charged but didn't. For example, when they were investigating this case, we know from their search warrant affidavits that they were looking at a separate count of a conspiracy to retain classified or national defense information or to transmit it. But they did not charge individual 1 and individual 2, who we understand to be the wife and daughter, with a conspiracy count. The other thing that they could have charged, based on the facts that they lay out here, is some sort of willful concealment of retention of this information. That was a charge that was lobbed at President Trump in the Mar-a-Lago documents case. Here, one of the things that prosecutors mentioned in the indictment is that when he was hacked by someone close to the Iranian Republic in 2021 and his lawyer went to the FBI, they did not disclose how John Bolton was actually using that account at the time, as Ken recalled, to send these notes to his wife and his daughter. On that basis, they might have been able to say that Bolton and his agents were willfully withholding from the FBI the fact that he was still in possession of classified information. They didn't. But the other thing I will tell you is every decision to prosecute is one of prosecutorial discretion. Just because the facts, as alleged in an indictment, seem to support the charges doesn't necessarily mean that every prosecutor would bring these charges. And one of the things that they have to be sure about, according to the Justice Manual, is that there is a reasonable likelihood that they will get a conviction here. And given some of the other facts, things going on the outside, particularly with respect to the beef between President Trump and John Bolton, that may be a harder threshold to meet, Ariel.
That's a really important point. Charles, what does it say to you that there was no Espionage Act charge in this case, at least at this point?
Well, what it says to me is that we have a limited set of facts and that the government, to Lisa's point, ultimately was talking about the fact that this is a case that prosecutors have chosen to present in a very particular way because of what they do and do not have. And so context matters with respect to what has been charged and what has not been charged. One of the things that prosecutors in this case are going to have a challenge with is establishing what the intent was, which is why you've had this conversation about the notes to the children and to the husband and to the wife, because ultimately what that is going to be used in order to try and establish is that Bolton knew and was aware of what it was he was doing, and that he did it with a particular intent. And so ultimately, when you're talking about what was and what isn't charged, and what we know in the indictment, because we have not fully heard the theory of the case from his attorney and what they're going to present, there is a limited context that we're seeing at this point. And so it's important not to rush to judgment, because all of the facts are in the indictment, but that's not all of the facts.
And I know, Lisa, you have a clarification. This is fluid. We're getting more details about this indictment as they come in. So tell us about the Espionage Act and possible charges there.
So all the charges here that have been brought against John Bolton so far are actually Espionage Act charges. But the Espionage Act doesn't sound exclusively in classified information. What it pertains to is that you are unlawfully either taking, removing, retaining, or even transmitting national defense information. And the statute defines that as information that, if it were in the possession of one of our enemies or adversaries, could be harmful to the national defense of the United States. What John Bolton hasn't been charged with is a statute that exclusively is about the unauthorized removal of or retention of classified information. That was the statute that prosecutors, again, listed in their search warrant applications to justify the searches of Bolton's home and office. So he hasn't been charged with anything exclusively about classified information. But again, all 18 counts here sound in provisions of the Espionage Act.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification. Michael, from a national security perspective, how damning is it that the National Security Advisor himself would be allegedly emailing top secret information to his own relatives?
So if the allegations in the indictment are true, and at this point in the game, we have reason to suspect the motivations of those who brought the charges, but it is a pretty damning indictment if the facts are true. And it's very worrisome, not just because Bolton was the National Security Advisor, but because he is simply one in a long line of very senior executive branch officials who have potentially fallen into this trap and retained classified information long after their tenure in government was over. The president himself was charged with this on dozens of counts in Florida. Former President Joe Biden was investigated for this. Former Vice President Mike Pence was investigated for this. A number of senior generals, such as David Petraeus and James Cartwright, were investigated and or pled guilty to this. There is a real problem within the U.S. government of very senior executives not taking their obligations to protect classified material seriously. But again, I want to hasten to add, I'm saying that outside even the context of just John Bolton's situation. This is very much a trend.
It seems like a concerning trend at that. Michael, the FBI interviewed Bolton about 8 times going back all the way to 2020 across 3 different administrations. His book went through the classification review process, the official channels. So what new information may have sparked these new charges pertaining to the messages from 2018 and 2019?
So it's very difficult to say. As Lisa noted, prosecutors only include the information in the indictment that is going to be most helpful to them in terms of securing the charges. So there could be a lot going on in the background that we'll find out at a later date that we don't know now. But based on my reading of the indictment, I suspect what happened is we already know from the public record that the first Trump administration looked at Bolton for charges pertaining to mishandling classified information when he published his book. The Biden administration chose not to pursue those. And now, many years later, new charges are being brought. So my guess would be something in the intervening years between when Biden declined the charges and today, something happened. And based on what we've seen in the indictment, that something appears to be that John Bolton himself reported the cyber intrusion, and that may have led the FBI or the intelligence community to do a deeper dig in terms of what exactly did the Iranians obtain, and therefore stumbled across new classified information he had.
Ken, I'm curious, is the standard practice in the intel community for people to go out and publish a memoir? Is that common practice? And how is the classification review process actually conducted? How did it fail here?
It's becoming increasingly common, Ariel, and this is a real gray area because we're not talking about documents that were marked classified. We're talking about notes that Bolton took based on his time in the Situation Room and other sensitive places that were for a diary pursuant to a memoir. And people are doing that more and more. And often they have to submit a manuscript to a publication review board. And then very often that board says, you need to take this or that out because it's classified. Well, they submitted that information over generally an unsecure email. So classified information got into the wild that way, but they often are not prosecuted for that. But this, what Bolton is alleged to have done seems to have taken it much further. It's similar to what General Petraeus was charged with. General Petraeus, remember, was the CIA director. He had black books full of classified information that he gave to an author who was preparing a book about him. When you write this stuff down and it's very detailed and the context is that you know it's sensitive national defense information, that's where you really get into trouble. And the real issue here is that the Iranians got access to it, so there was real damage. And just to go back to what Michael was saying, the way they found out about this is my reporting, it's not in the indictment, is that the U.S. intelligence community penetrated the system where Iran had these emails, and they discovered them. And that's how they got new information in this case, and they learned that there was classified information in that AOL account that John Bolton was sharing.
What a circuitous way to figure all of this out. Charles, we've seen President Trump slam John Bolton out in the public square quite a bit. Could that factor into Bolton's defense here?
It could, and I expect that it will. This is a classic case of two things can be true, Ariel. So on one hand, as Lisa's already laid out, prosecutors have the discretion as to when and whether they decide to bring a particular case. And I suspect that when this case is placed in context by his attorneys, they are going to point directly to all of the rhetoric that Donald Trump has been putting out about prosecuting his political foes. The beef between Bolton and Trump is not something new, and it's not a secret. And so the conversation is going to be, from their perspective, this was basically a hit job that was ordered by the president on him for this type of prosecution. And I think that that is going to play in terms of their theory of the case and their presentation ultimately to a jury, which is where I expect this ultimately to flesh out.
These two things are not mutually exclusive.
Correct.